I'm pleased to be able to introduce Julia Fromholz, who joined Human Rights First roughly 4 years ago and now runs the organization's Crimes Against Humanity program, which seeks to reduce the incidence and the duration of mass atrocities by developing practical policy approaches for the U.S. government and other international actors, focusing especially on those states and commercial entities that helps us to sustain the atrocities.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd also like to thank Brookings and USIP for inviting me to participate on the panel. It's an honor to be on the panel with the special advisor and with Andrew and Lawrence. The mass atrocities of recent times have spurred a range of responses, from public mobilization to initiatives such as the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which has been mentioned already today. These atrocities and these responses have galvanized a consensus among citizens and among policymakers that confronting atrocities should be a foreign policy priority. But the track record of the U.S. and of the international community in dealing with these atrocities has shown us that they're extremely complex and challenging. Human Rights First, therefore, believes that an appetite exists for practical tools that can change the basic dynamics when atrocities are underway and contribute to efforts to halt violence against civilians. One potentially effective approach on which we are focusing is to focus on the means used to commit mass atrocities and on those actors who furnish the means. Mass atrocities are organized crimes, so crippling the means used to organize and sustain them, such as money, communications networks, transportation networks, and other resources, can disrupt the execution of these crimes. A key element of the organization that is particularly relevant to international responses is the role of third-party actors. History shows us that perpetrators are generally unable to carry out these crimes on their own. As creative and resourceful as they are, they're generally dependent on direct or indirect support from external actors, whether that is a government, commercial actors, or individuals whose goods and services enable them to wage attacks against civilians. Some work focusing on what we call enablers is currently being done, although without using that term. For example, there are several organizations that track arms and ammunition transfers and advocate for attention to be paid to the sources of weapons. Another example is the Enough Project's work on conflict minerals in Congo, which has brought great attention to that problem. And in fact, this morning, the House Foreign Affairs Committee marked up a piece of legislation aimed at tackling that problem. But this work is happening piecemeal, which means it's not coordinated and it's not covering all possibly useful targets. The U.S. government and others, but right now we at Human Rights First are mostly focused on Washington and New York, should look systematically at enablers when looking to prevent or respond to atrocities. Doing this would open up a new set of policy responses or a new set of pressure points. A quick example of this comes from the most recent report by the UN Sudan panel of experts. That group found that technicals, or 4x4 trucks that are mounted with weapons, contributed greatly to the widespread nature of the conflict in Sudan, or in Darfur, excuse me. They also found that more Toyota trucks that were later turned into technicals and then used in Darfur came from the official Toyota distributorship or dealership and secondhand dealers in the United Arab Emirates than from any other source. This information doesn't all of a sudden make this an easy question to solve, but that evidence could be used to develop various policy responses such as, or including sanctions. Cutting the supply chain for all trucks going to Darfur cannot, in my view, be done. But going down that road by drawing attention to these enablers, the ones who are selling the trucks, and then subjecting them to the greatest possible pressure could decrease the supply chain enough that perpetrators might end up changing their calculus. I don't mean to suggest that this would make preventing, or that this or following enablers at all would make preventing or responding to atrocities easy. But it's because of the complexity of these crimes that we need to be looking at all possibly effective levers to prevent and mitigate them. To use this concept of enablers in preventing and responding to atrocities, the first stop, in my view, is with the new interagency structure on atrocities prevention, which is in the process of being formed. And as many people probably know, the NSC has a new director of atrocities prevention who is working on forming this structure. The structure should include a systematic focus on enablers of mass atrocities. That focus should include things such as tasking the appropriate intelligence agencies with increasing gathering and analysis of intelligence on enablers of mass atrocities in key countries. Some aspects of intelligence analysis that should be considered when developing policy are the identities of the enablers, their specific roles, and the actors or connections in the supply chains that are particularly vulnerable to pressure. The interagency structure should also look at tools that already exist in the United States government, but in distinct but similar environments. For example, particularly since 9/11, the Treasury Department has had success in diminishing financing for terrorism. The same tools used against enablers of terrorism could be applied, if the political will exists, to enablers of mass atrocities. The interagency structure should therefore assess the tools used by the Treasury Department to combat terrorist facilitators, money launderers, and drug traffickers. They could then determine how these approaches could be adapted or applied to tackle those commercial entities and individuals that are enabling atrocities. Tools also exist where UN sanctions are already in place. In those cases, UN groups of experts' reports often include confidential annexes listing individuals they believe violated UN embargoes, and those are individuals they believe therefore should be subject to individual sanctions by the UN. The U.S. government interagency structure could task the Treasury Department with further investigating these individuals listed in panel of expert confidential annexes for possible inclusion on targeted sanctions lists. The Defense Department and other agencies that do technical assistance in high-risk countries could also help tackle enablers, especially before atrocities begin. AFRICOM and other agencies that run technical assistance and capacity building programs to boost capacities in African countries and elsewhere, specifically to deal with transnational challenges. Tackling enablers of atrocities could be made one aspect of those programs. Resources should also be increased to enhance the capacity of states to deal with enablers that operate in or through their territory. There are also noteworthy regional initiatives in Africa and elsewhere focused on building capacities to address transnational challenges. For example, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, one of its aims is to improve the certification processes for natural resources extracted in the region. A strong certification regime could cripple enablers of mass atrocities. U.S. support for these efforts could enhance their ability to tackle the enablers of mass atrocities. Through these means and others, by focusing on enablers, the U.S. government could squeeze the supply chain that makes atrocities possible. These situations are so complex and so difficult that we should be looking as broadly as possible for pressure points and for creative policy options.
Okay. Thank you, Julia.